Peace, everyone. Dr. Yoder, how are you today? Don, would you talk a little bit about your youth and when you feel you started being interested in folklore and folklife studies?
Yes, since I'm in the hot seat, I will reveal some secrets about my career. I had a very wonderful grandfather when I was a little boy named Wharton Chronister in Center County, Pennsylvania. He had a farm, and I visited the farm. We didn't live on the farm because my father was a big mechanical engineer for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He founded all the apprentice schools in 5 states, wherever the PRR system had shops. They trained, he wrote the textbooks and all that. So we lived in a place called Altoona, which was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in the 1840s. But my father was from a farm also, and for 10 years during my boyhood, he owned the farm. After his mother died, my grandmother died in 1924, and he bought the farm, and we spent a great deal of time there, even though we never lived there. So it was from my grandfather's tales as I sat on his lap as a little boy. He was born in 1861, a Civil War period, and he grew up in the high Allegheny Mountain area of central Pennsylvania, which has a distinct folk culture, which I've learned to study through him. And he told me stories of his grandfather, who was born in 1776. So I used to use this in class, that in my memory culture that I carry around with me, as you carry around your memory cultures from your experiences and what you learned from your families. I had 5 generations of family lore and folk cultural lore from 1776, 1861 to me. And I told students, of course, that they can do the same thing by asking their older relatives things which are not often in print. And that's what I found in dealing with my own family. The people knew things which I could never find in book form. And this profited me, and so forth. Anyway, I began to be interested when I was a boy in the culture of Pennsylvania. And I also found out from my parents, who were very wonderful parents and supportive of everything that I wanted to do in my career. My father didn't want to make a mechanical engineer out of me, fortunately, because I hate machinery. I don't feel easy with machinery, that is. I would never have made a farmer, actually, because of that. But anyway, I learned that my parents were very different. My wonderful parents were different. My mother grew up in central Pennsylvania, in Center County. She didn't know any folk songs. She knew all the First World War songs, including the horrible one called "Give Me a Lucifer to Light My Fag." And it was a strange song in an area which was against cigarette smoking, especially for women. The fag, of course, in that case, was the cigarette. And she knew all the other songs. She knew the hymns of the Methodist Church in which she grew up, and I learned them too as a boy and value them, even though I don't always believe in the theology anymore. I still love the tunes, and I play them on the piano. I like them. Anyway, my mother didn't have much folk culture, except she cooked. She was partly Pennsylvania Dutch and partly English and Irish and Welsh Quaker in her background, and her table showed the results of Pennsylvania food history. She did cook Pennsylvania Dutch food. I grew up on sauerkraut and pork and so forth, and scrapple and things like that. But her general folk culture had kind of disappeared. Her Pennsylvania Dutch background, the Chronisters, my grandfather was Pennsylvania Dutch background, although his ancestors were Austrian originally. They didn't speak the dialect anymore. My great-grandfather knew it, but my grandfather didn't know it. So the dialect, as we call it, we used to call it, the Pennsylvania Dutch language now, had disappeared in my mother's background. When I went to my father's background, which was east of the Susquehanna River in Schuylkill County, in the Higgins and Macantongo areas, about which I have written many local important folk cultural treatments. I found that they had a folk culture living. They talked Pennsylvania Dutch at home. My father, when he visited his sisters and brothers, always talked Dutch with them. And this meant something to me as a little boy, hearing this strange language which I didn't know. I know it now, I can use it, and I write letters in it. I value it highly because it was our language, but I didn't know it then. But I heard it all my early days, and I became interested in it, and finally, as I said, learned it. Also, the foods were completely Pennsylvania Dutch. My Aunt Emma Yoder was a magnificent cook, and I learned a lot from her. She also had a photographic memory for the songs that she had heard. And I began to collect, I was first a folklorist, first an ethnomusicologist. I began collecting the folk songs that my Aunt Emma knew. And from her girlhood, she was born 1873. She was the child of the Civil War generation. And in my recording, I found that though that generation had the best knowledge of the Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture, the people born in the 1870s and 80s, like my aunts and my father, born in 1883. So they knew folk songs, and my mother didn't know them. So I often compared the differences of what I learned from my parents, their differences in culture, was what Theodor Heuss, the Chancellor of Germany, said in his autobiography. He said he never understood himself until he realized the difference between his Swabian father, Heuss, and his Rhineland mother. I think that's a very interesting parallel. I had the same experience in my own family. But the riches of folk culture, the Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture, as I call it, that I learned from my father's family, helped me to become a folklorist and eventually a folklife scholar. I think it's a beginning. We all have these personal experiences in our families and backgrounds, and they do have an influence on us.
Don, could you say a little bit about the different religions that you encountered as a youth?
Yes. In my teaching at Penn and everywhere else, I've always tried to stress, I don't like the word stress, but you know what I mean, accent the importance of religion and the religious background, spirituality in culture. And in every folk culture, you have to understand the religion. And one of the things that I disliked about folklore, as I began to learn it, divided into genres as it used to be, they had no genre for religion. They had no way of studying religion. They had a genre called superstition, a word which I think should be dropped because it's unscientific, it's judgmental whenever you use it. If you say someone is superstitious, that means that you have a pure religion and they have a false religion. So anyway, I felt that that was necessary to instruct my students in folklore and so forth, that religion was an important aspect in all culture and in folk culture. And as I defined it, I wrote a symposium on folk religion, which was published in 1974 in Western Folklore. It's the entire edition of one of the numbers of that year. And I wrote toward a definition of folk religion, where I went into the background in European research, as I always have done in my teaching, and what was done in America to look at folk religion and so forth. I found, for instance, that one of the roots of folk religion, the study of it, came around 1900 in Germany. There was a professor in the theological seminary, I forget where it was, at a German university, named Drews, Paul Drews, and he wrote a plea for students in seminaries to be able to understand the religion of the people that they would minister to in the country parishes. He felt that there were two levels of religion. There was the official religion that was taught in the seminaries, and there was the folk religion, the folk spirituality that the people themselves had, the people's religion. And they didn't always jive, they didn't always understand each other. So that was one of the roots of my interest in folk religion. And another root was the American anthropology apology interest in the folk Catholicism of Central America. Many books on that, and the whole process of looking at how Catholicism had adjusted to the native Indian religions in Mexico and Central America and so forth. So those were the two roots really that created my interest in folk religion. I understand that some people don't like the term folk religion because religion suggests something official. I didn't mention you, Leonard. Leonard likes the term vernacular religion instead of folk, and that has some possibilities, but I like to tell him that the word vernacular should be limited to linguistics, and it originally meant in Latin the language that the house slaves spoke in a Roman household. So take that along, Leonard. Anyway, I think the term folk spirituality perhaps is a little bit better than folk religion, because religion does have the official mode sometimes. We think of religions of the world, and they're organized, and they're official, they're standard, and so forth. But anyway, I've had great fun in teaching folk religion. I began, I think, the first course in American folk religion at a university. As far as I know, it was 1957. I don't know whether Henry Glassy, who's here today, was in that one. I don't think you were there at Penn yet, were you, in 57? When did you come to Penn?
63, I think.
Oh, I see, okay. Yes, I have my outline of the course, and it has a picture on the cover, which I distributed to students. It shows a Catholic version of the universe, the spiritual universe. It's an ex voto, which we're going to talk about tonight in my lecture, and it shows the three persons of the Trinity up in heaven, and clouds, and underneath on a cloud is the Virgin Mary and her divine Son, and down at the bottom is the person who made the prayer that was answered, that she had this painting made, and there's a picture of the church where she made the prayer. Anyway, this is Catholic folk art, and it's interesting that the three members of the Trinity up at the top all have exactly the same papal headdresses. They all look like the popes. But my outline goes like this. I had an introduction on what is religion, how to study religion, the different interpretations, the history of religion, church history, phenomenology of religion, sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, and so forth and so forth. Chapters on medieval religion and its legacy, Protestantism and folk religion, magic, witchcraft, and religious healing. Those were 2 lectures. They needed it. African American religions, American Indian religions. I'm not a specialist in either of those, but of course I included them in the course. A big lecture on religious folk music, survey of folk hymnody, hymnology, and religious folk music in general. The types, songs, hymns, and spiritual songs, the gospel songs and hymns, the carols at Christmas, and so forth. And the complex history of the spiritual in America, of which I have written a great deal. Another chapter was religious costume and sacred space, the idea of sacred space in houses, the holy corner in the dining room of the house, above the place where the peasants ate their meals, because eating a meal together with prayer and with the holy corner was a holy act in our ancestors' lives. And then I talked about religious space, sacred space in architecture, in churches and meeting houses. I used Pennsylvania examples, of course. I had a lecture on religious folk art, the relation of art and religion in history and prehistory. I'm talking about that tonight. And a lecture on tombstone art, funerary symbolism in Europe and America, and so forth, and then 2 sections, seminar reports. And there I could be silent and listen to the brilliant reports of my students. That was the outline of my course, and as I said, I enjoyed teaching that. Beginning in 1957, I taught it almost every other year, I think, and then I began teaching regional courses, especially for the American Civilization Department, which once was very strong under Tony Garvin. It was the broadest American Civ program in America because of Tony Garvin's expansion of it from literature. Most Americanists looked at American culture via literature, via Mark Twain, via Emerson, and so forth. And this was a very limited view, like the folklorist limitations sometimes. But Tony Garvin added material culture, architecture, as elements of culture that should be studied by Americanists. And so I taught courses, they called them area courses. They had a course in Southern culture done by the very brilliant woman who is now the president of Harvard University. And I taught the course beginning in I forget when it was, in Pennsylvania German culture, history and culture, Pennsylvania German ethnography. I have the outline of that here too. And I would call that Pennsylvania Dutch culture now, and I'll go into that, the reasons in a moment. But I also began to teach a course in the Quaker culture of the Delaware Valley. Pennsylvania, of course, was a Quaker colony, and William Penn influenced through his ideas on tolerance and religious freedom. He influenced Jersey also, because he was one of the founders of at least West Jersey. There were 2 Jerseys in the ancient period, East and West Jersey. Penn was in charge of the Burlington area, and he sent Quakers to that area in the 1670s, before Pennsylvania was founded. He also helped to shape the tolerance and the laws of Delaware. So that whole area around Philadelphia, the Delaware Valley, was a model Quaker society up until the 1840s and 50s, and I taught some very interesting courses in that. And they were called, as I said, area courses by the American Civ Department, but they were also Folklore Department courses.
Don, can you say something about your own education, where you went to college and then graduate school, and who were your professors?
Oh, good.
And how they influenced
I'd like
you?
to do that, yes. I went to a Pennsylvania Dutch college, Franklin and Marshall College, which was founded as Franklin College in 1787 for the Pennsylvania German youth who needed to learn English and needed to keep up their German culture also. And in 1854, they joined with Mercersburg College, and the college at Mercersburg, Marshall College, named for John Marshall, the early Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and they founded Franklin and Marshall College, 1854. And it was always run by the Reformed Church, which was important in my Yoder background. Yoders were Reformed, Zwinglian Reformed in Switzerland, they were Reformed in the Palatinate, and they brought their Reformed faith to Pennsylvania, and that came down to my father's family. So that was rather important to me. I went to this college. The ministers, the preachers, the professors were sometimes ministers in the Reformed Church in the United States, the Pennsylvania Dutch Reformed Church, and the president was a minister, and so forth. And they had the best library on Pennsylvania Dutch studies that in captivity at the time. I made the mistake of going to another college before I went back to F&M as a teacher in 1949. I spent a year at Muhlenberg College, the Lutheran College in Allentown. I loved Allentown, I loved Lehigh County. I was able to buy my first car that year, which I described as a real rite of passage which Van Gennep should have used in his canonized list. So I went all around Lehigh and Berks counties and the back roads, and I began to photograph the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, including the hex sign barns, which I've just done, helped a new book on the hex signs. I'll show you that in a moment. But my experiences at F&M, Franklin and Marshall, were very precious to me, and I made lifelong friends among the students, of course, as we all do, and I was able to use all the resources that the college library had, very excellent resources in Pennsylvania Dutch Studies. And this was important to me, and after I finished at F&M, I went to the University of Chicago. That was away from Pennsylvania, but I didn't like the city of Chicago as much as I loved the university and the southern part of the city there, but I explored the city on its elevated railways and went to the bookshops. I bought some very rare Mennonite books that had been pried loose from Mennonite families. I bought for $5, a Margaret book published at Pirmasens in the Palatinate. It was the second German edition of the Margaret book of the Mennonites. The first edition was published in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, outside of Lancaster in 1748 and 9, the largest book published in early America. But this Pirmasens edition had the original plates. This was originally a Dutch book published in 1660 and 1685, and they had Dutch plates of martyrdom by John Lykens, who was himself a Mennonite, a Dutch Mennonite, a famous artist. And the Pirmasens edition used those plates. The Pennsylvania edition did not. And I took that book to Goshen College. Goshen College is a Mennonite college in northern Indiana. It has the largest collection and archive of Anabaptist and Mennonite materials in the world, I think, today. And Harold S. Bender was the brilliant dean of the college there, and I gave him the copy of the Pirmasens edition of the Margaret book, and he gave me a whole set of the Mennonite Quarterly Review, which began in 1947. This was in about 1927, and this was about 20 years of that very fine scholarly journal about sectarian religion in America. So I got my degree in 1947, but I had already migrated to New York City, of all places, for Pennsylvania, and I taught at Union Theological Seminary, which of course, as you know, is one of the great seminaries of Protestantism in the United States. And we had some very distinguished faculty there. Reinhold Niebuhr was there as a contemporary of mine, although I didn't get to know him very well. And Dr. Tillich, the great German liberal scholar, a refugee from Hitler's Germany, was there. He used to amaze the students. His English was so difficult to understand. He used the word wakawoom for vacuum. And the students went wild over that in his lectures. Anyway, I was there 2 years, and I also spent a summer in 50 teaching at the summer school of Union Seminary, which was held jointly with Columbia University. And that enabled me to earn enough money to go to Europe for my very first trip to Europe, a thrilling academic trip. It was 6 weeks. I went on a chartered plane that was to take American professors and students to Europe, hoping to bring back European students and professors. I had a glorious time. I went to Paris first. I was working on a chapter on the American ecumenical movement for a book that the World Council of Churches in Geneva was editing. And I was hosted by other authors in Paris. One of them was Dr. Brandreth, who was the resident Anglican priest in the main Anglican church in Paris. It was up near the Arch of Triumph, and he lived in a 5-story house, and his mother was living with him, and she was very witty. She would sing, after supper, she would sing music hall songs that she had learned as a girl, and which was part of my education also. And one day, Father Brandreth And I spent the whole day going to Chartres to see the cathedral. Of course, I can never forget that. And then after Paris, I was there a week, exploring the great city in every way. I went to the Paris East Station and got on the train for Germany. And I went through a place called Bar-le-Duc and a place called Metz, which was an early Protestant center of the 17th century, and got into Germany and got off at Kaiserslautern, where a friend of mine, who became a lifelong friend after that, Dr. Fritz Braun, who was the leading authority on folk culture and the history of and genealogy of the Palatinate, was at the station to meet me. He didn't have a car because it was only 5 years after the war. This was in 1950, and I saw lots of evidence of the destruction in the cities. It was quite an experience for an American to see that. I hadn't been able to go to Germany before the war, as some of my colleagues had. And we drove around. He rented a car, and I saw the culture of the Palatinate, which I am very favorite. I'm an aficionado of that today because so much is true of the culture there, which was brought over to Pennsylvania. I don't believe that the Pennsylvania Dutch culture is a little Germany in America. That's a mistake. All cultures, immigrant cultures, are hybrid cultures because they have to adjust to the new environment as the German-speaking people, and I don't call them Germans because there was no united Germany in the 18th century when the several 100,000 immigrants came. And so most of them settled in Pennsylvania, but some of them went down the Great Wagon Road to Western Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and even Georgia. And later they moved to other places from there. But the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, which I'm a specialist in, and have always been interested in writing about it, and I'm still writing about it at the age of 92. It was a hybrid culture, and I prefer to use the term Pennsylvania Dutch rather than Pennsylvania German. I want to go into that just a bit, because if you use German, you cut out the Swiss. You cut out my Yoders, they were Swiss. You cut out my Gingrichs. I only tell close friends that my grandmother on my mother's side was a Gingrich because I didn't approve of Newt Gingrich, and some of us I did. So you can take that along too. But the Swiss were at least a third of the Pennsylvania Dutch population, and still are. And you cut out the French Huguenots, who were maybe 10%. There were lots of persecuted French Protestants called Huguenots, who in 1685, when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had freed Protestantism for worship and building churches and so forth in France, in 1598, he said the Protestants have to leave. And it was a terrific blow for the French economy because these Protestants were upper middle class, a lot of them. They were weavers, they had factories, cloth factories, they had pottery factories. They took all these skills to Germany. And so if you say Pennsylvania German, you cut out this element. You cut out the Austrians, like my chronisters. My mother's people, the chronister, I always knew they were Pennsylvania Dutch, but I was thrilled to find that they were Austrian. And they were from Niederösterreich, from Lower Austria, and in 1650, after the 30 Years' War, all the Protestants of Austria were told to convert to Catholicism or leave the country, so several 100,000 left. And they went up the Danube to Regensburg and across country up into what is now the northern part of Bavaria, which is the provinces of Unterfranken, Mittelfranken, and Oberfranken, Franconia. It's now part of Bavaria, but at that time it was mostly a Protestant enclave, and they could worship in their Protestant way there. And then 100 years later, my chronister ancestor came to Pennsylvania. So you cut out the Austrians if you say Pennsylvania German. Also, I hate to say this, but I think the term German has a slight distaste to it, a tinge of danger in using it because of what happened to it in the Nazi period, in the 12 years of the Nazi period, and even before, in 1933 to 1945. So, but I realize that in Pennsylvania, a lot of scholars say, oh, let's call them Pennsylvania Germans. It's a scholarly term and so forth. But it has so many faults that I prefer to say Pennsylvania Dutch. And if you look up the word Dutch in the English, the Oxford English Dictionary, and its successor, you'll find whole pages of the meaning of Dutch. In Shakespeare's time and in the Middle Ages, a Dutchman was a person from the Rhineland in Europe. And later on, they divided them into High Dutch, the Germans proper, and the Low Dutch, the Holland Dutch, and the Low Dutch Germans in the north of Germany. And Dutch is a perfectly legitimate term. It's not a corruption of Deutsch at all. It's a cognate form back in the Middle Ages of Deutsch. So I prefer, and this is part of my sermon, I prefer to use Pennsylvania Dutch rather than Pennsylvania German. Forgive me if you prefer the other.
You studied with some famous church historians when you were at the University of Chicago.
The historians that you studied with at the University of
Oh,
Chicago.
yes, thank you, yes. I was very happy and very lucky to be the research assistant for 3 years at the University of Chicago to a man named William Warren Sweet. And he was the person, the scholar, who knew more about American religion in America than anyone else. We used to call it American Church History, and my degree from the University of Chicago is a PhD in American Church History. That's a misnomer today. It's politically incorrect because religion in America includes more than the church history of the Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox churches. It includes all the Oriental influences, it includes the Native American resurgence of religion and so forth. So, but anyway, in 1929, Dr. Sweet was asked to come, I think he was at DePaul University in Indiana, and he was asked to come to the University of Chicago, to the Divinity School, and begin work in American church history. And he developed this in a very beautiful way. He wrote the standard histories of American religion, and I was his chief research, his only research assistant for 3 years. And we were editing the Asbury letters of Bishop Asbury, 1745 to 1816. Francis Asbury was sent over by John Wesley to organize the Methodists in America, and he did. And his letters were never published, and Dr. Sweet gathered them all from archives, and I was working on them for a book, which unfortunately he never did. But I did edit some Methodist ministers' diaries, which are very full of social history and so forth. They were very observant men. For his book on Methodism on the Frontier, which was like a 600 page book, I did all the editing of the documents. It came out in 1946, and I shouldn't say this, but he should have put my name on the title page. I would never have a student do all this work and not put it on the title page. But he did say in the preface that he couldn't have done the work without my help, which was a little sop in my favor. Anyway, he was interesting to work with. He was from Kansas, and he had some interesting ways of talking, and had some called the Baptists and Methodists and so forth. He had a bit of regional English in his way of talking, and I always appreciated that. And one summer, I had the nice experience of driving with him to his farm in New Hampshire, which he had bought for $2,000, about 200 acres and woods and a nice farmhouse and a barn and so forth. It was a very cheap buy, and we spent a week there and very pleasantly, and we enjoyed the trip driving. I did some of the driving also on the way to New Hampshire. I also had a very precious teacher named John Thomas McNeil, who was born on Prince Edward Island in the 1870s, I guess, and he was professor of medieval church history at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School where I was registered. And he and I became even, I think, almost closer than Dr. Sweet and I. And when he retired and moved to Union Theological Seminary in New York, he invited me to come as his assistant and to teach the American religion courses and to assist him in his general surveys of church history. And I did that. That was good experience for a young scholar. And I will always value his very important influence on my life. And I'm writing I called him JTM in my letters, and other people did too, John Thomas McNeill. And I'm writing a kind of a memoir, a tribute to him called Remembering JTM. And he, for instance, in his teaching of church history, had some set pieces. One of them was the ordination of the 9 ordinations, or is it 7 ordinations of a Catholic priest, and then the opposite, where you defrock them all and take all the ordinations away. That was a set piece that he liked to go through. He also liked to go through the description of a monastery, and we learned a great deal about the English language. Our word dormitory in universities comes from the monasteries, and a lot of other influences, because the monks friars were among the first professors at the universities founded in the 11th and 12th centuries. Anyway, he also had some very favorite Italian words like Pico della Mirandola, which I could never get out of my mind. And I often thought that, remembered as he pronounced these wonderful Italian words and names, that I thought of Whitfield, his saying that who was the great actor in the 18th century? That he said his pronunciation of Mesopotamia was the high point in the English pronunciation. So Dr. McNeill was his Pico della Mirandola and other voice names like that, I can never forget. I also visited the McNeils. They bought a farm in New England, and they had me visit them, and we corresponded after I left Union for Pennsylvania, and he was a great influence on me. And he was the great historian of Calvinism in the 20th century. He wrote the best books on that, and he wrote a very important book called Medieval Handbooks of Penance with Helena Gamer. This is a book which has influenced my research, because in one of the documents that he included in the book, the Corrector of Worms, the man was known as the Corrector, his book was called The Corrector of Worms. He said that the priests, these were manuals for priests, how to act dealing with their parishioners. And he said, on the calends of January 1st, do not allow members of your parish to wear animal masks. And this is the background of the Pennsylvania Dutch Belsnickel custom, which we have connected with Christmas and New Year's, where someone dressed up in furs and masks and so forth came to the house and knocked on the window and was let in. And this was at Christmas. Sometimes it was the father of the house, and he had a mask on, and he had a bag of candy or nuts that he would throw on the floor, and when the children bent down to grab them up, he would give them a token switching. And this was called the Belsnickel. Nickel means Nicholas, of course. I asked my father when I was interviewing him many times how he celebrated Christmas when he was a boy, and he said he never heard of Santa Claus, but the Belsnickel came, and he described that. Sometimes it was my grandfather who dressed up in rough clothes and a mask. And then the Belsnickels also dressed up on Christmas Eve. Young people dressed up and went around to the houses sometimes. And on New Year's Day, the young people, young unmarried people, and some teenagers dressed up and rode horseback and went into the towns and hooped it up on the streets and yelled and so forth. And this was called Belsnickling. So this is part of the Pennsylvania Dutch folk religion, the folk customs, which it's now dead except for a few museums and so forth which have Belsnickel performances. just for fun, since we know so much about them. The newspapers were full of let's stop this Belsnickel business in the 1870s. The Belsnickels riding into town caused trouble, and so forth. So McNeil's book, Medieval Handbooks of Penance, with the reference to not wearing masks on the calendars of January, is very important to me.
Don, when did you begin teaching it then, and did you talk about those early years in the religious thought department?
Talk about your early years at the University of Pennsylvania when you began teaching in religious thought.
Oh, yes, right. I had the great joy of being called to the University of Pennsylvania in 1956 through one of my professors that I had at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. And unfortunately, I was in Europe that summer, and the professor died before I began to teach, and there was only one other member of the department, Harold Murphy, and we kept the department going for 4 years at least with our courses. And finally, the dean had to appoint a chairman of the program, and they did. And then eventually, the program added other members of the faculty to the staff, and it became a viable and vital department in the University of Pennsylvania. And I was very happy in that department, except that my interests began to shade over mostly into folk culture. And so I felt it was necessary eventually to move after there was a folklore department. In 1964, I think it was, McEdward Leach founded the folklore department. He was an English professor, and he had the narrow verbal arts definition of folklore, which of course was standard at the time. And he began the Penn folklore program in 1964, but he died very soon after that, a year or two. And Roy Nichols, who was a distinguished American historian, who was dean of the graduate school, knew me and knew my work and liked it, and he appointed me chairman. And I was able at that time to change the title from just folklore department to folklore and folklife. And so I think it's important that in my career that I can say that I founded the first graduate department of folklife studies in the United States, and this is true. And the term folklife came to America mostly through Alfred Shoemaker, my colleague in the Pennsylvania Dutch world, that I worked with for over 15 years, starting the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Center in 1949 with its magazine or journal, the Pennsylvania Dutchman, which became Pennsylvania Folklife, which I edited for 20-some years. And in 1950, we began the Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival at Kutztown. And this was a different type. Mostly folk festivals are simply performances of music and dance on a stage to a captive audience up to this time. This was a folk festival which attempted to put on display in ways that you can't do in books or museums the culture of the Pennsylvania Dutch, as much as you could do it in a week's time in tents and with craftsmen and so forth. And we had the idea that people, the tourists, we wanted to educate the tourists on what Pennsylvania Dutch meant. And because there were all sorts of misconceptions. One is that the tourists think that the Amish are the Pennsylvania Dutch. That's the common idea today. And the Amish are only 5% of the whole total Pennsylvania Dutch population. So we began this as kind of a type of adult education for the tourists to adult these ignorant tourists who need to be educated, and forgive that word, but you know it's true. And they could talk to the craftsmen who were making pottery or thatching barns and doing things like that. And we had 2 stages, the main stage where we had programs all day, and the seminar stage, of which I was in charge, and we had programs on witchcraft and powwowing, the type of folk medicine that the Pennsylvania Dutch is specialized in, and it still exists, using charms in the hope of curing the ills of man and beast. It was a veterinarian side of powwowing as well as a human side. And I had a program in folk costumes. I had the costumes of the Mennonites and the Amish and the Schwenkfelders and the Ephrata community, all illustrated by people wearing authentic costumes on the stage. And I talked about why sectarians wear costume. One of the best examples, my examples, is what I learned in the Baltimore yearly meeting discipline of the Society of Friends. They said plainness is to us like a hedge against the dangers of the world. It does not make the ground enclosed any holier than the ground outside, but it does protect the person who wears the plain garb. I think that's a very beautiful statement and a very meaningful statement. So I call it the hedge theory of plain costume, and I found that that's also true of the Hasidic Jews. A famous book about the Hasidic Jews of Hungary and New York City says that he interviewed Hasidic men and said, with my Hasidic dress and beard, I can't go to the theater, and so forth. It's a hedge against the dangers that the outside world presents to the sectarian mind. And the word world, of course, means the cultural world that surrounds, like to use the Amish as an example. And they say that the ways of the world, the fashions of the world are sinful. They use the word worldly as a pseudonym for sinful.
Don, you're a great collector of objects and material culture. Could you talk about your life? When did you start collecting things?
Yes, I need
Yeah, when did you start collecting material culture objects?
When did I start collecting material objects? I guess when I was a little boy, little toys and so forth. But I collected folk art, Pennsylvania Dutch folk art, which I'm going to speak about tonight also. And I found that my family had fracture, original pieces of baptismal certificates and house blessings and so forth. My dear Aunt Emma, whom I mentioned as one of the great cooks that I've known, and with the photographic memory of songs that I used in my book, Pennsylvania Spirituals, she one day went to her bureau drawer and brought out a roll of documents and gave them to me as the most logical member of the family to protect in the future. And they were documents that went back to the 1780s in my family, the Yoders and related families. And they were folk art. They were decorated by folk artists and so forth. Some of them were printed, but they were still decorated around the edges by local schoolmasters and so forth who liked to do this sort of work. And so I began collecting, and I also became interested in religious folk art, especially. We have a big expert on this sitting right here with Leonard, who really is the expert now on religious folk art in the United States, not only Catholic, but the whole business. And I'm going to say more about that tonight. Anyway, I became interested in this, and my collection was so good that I was able to interest at Cabrini College, where Leonard is the head of the religion department, and they took it over, and it's known as the Don Yoder Collection of Religious Art. And Leonard arranged a very important exhibit at Cabrini College. Cabrini College is 50 years old. It was named for a Catholic nun who was she canonized, actually, from Mother Cabrini. And it's a very wonderful small college. It's about a mile away from where I live, and I have a nice contact with it. And I spoke at that exhibit that Leonard had arranged of the treasures that I had collected over the last 50 years. And it was a beautiful exhibit. And I also mentioned Leonard. I said Leonard is a very special person to me because at Penn he took all my undergraduate courses, and then he went away to the Harvard Divinity School for 2 years and came back filled with new ideas and took all my graduate courses. I said I couldn't get rid of it. And of course everyone laughed, as you have too. Anyway, I appreciate what Leonard has done in organizing the field of religious folk art and of religious art in America. And I'm going to show a picture of the cover of his new book called Graces Received, which comes from the Italian Grazia Ricevuta, Grace Received. It's his collection of Italian ex-votos, which just came out. A very, very beautiful volume, and I'm going to speak more about that tonight. So this is a tribute from Don Yoder to Leonard Primiano on his excellent knowledge, his perception of the importance of this whole field of religious folk art, which also Henry Blassie is an expert in some of these things too.
Thank you for the plug. Don, I know you have a lot of experiences with various folklorists who were visiting Penn, and I was wondering if you could give us some memories about people like Richard Dorson. Could you talk a little bit about Richard Dorson?
Yeah. Could you talk about some of the folklorists who visited the University of Pennsylvania, including Richard Dorson?
Yes, indeed. And my program, which, by the way, which I changed the title, as I said, from Folklore to Folklore and Folklife. And one of my dearest friends, Robert Wildhaber, professor of Volkskunde, folk cultural studies at the University of Basel, and director of the Swiss Museum for Volkskunde, or folk culture, we became lifelong friends and corresponded. I have a big pack of wonderful letters from him, and he gave me materials on Swiss folk art and so forth. And he told me that he was editor of many things. He was editor of the Schweizerisches Archiv für Volkskunde, the best European folk cultural journal, the Swiss Archive for Folk Culture. He was editor of that for many years, and he wrote the best reviews of books of any reviewer that I have ever read. And he told me that he was also editor of the International Bibliography of Folk Culture, the Internationale Volkskundliche Bibliographie, and which began in 1919. And he changed the English title of that from the International Bibliography of Folklore to the International Bibliography of Folklore and Folklife because of my work at Penn and the program at Penn. I think that's important. And somebody has changed that. I'd like to know who. I won't mention any names, but they've gone back to folklore instead of folklore and folklife. And I think that's a mistake because I use folklife. Both folklore and folklife are kind of fading out in Europe, and the scholars are calling the discipline neither folklore or folklife, but they call it regional ethnology. They're using the accepted term ethnology, which means a general study of culture. And they speak of European ethnology, Europäische Ethnologie, or Regionale Ethnologie, regional ethnology, as the title of their departments. Some of them still use Volkskunde as a secondary title, but I think that's rather important that both of the folk terms are being phased out, at least in Germany, because of the use that they were put to in the Nazi period, in the Third Reich.
Dr. Dorson.
Oh, yes, okay, our program, I wanted you to know about Dr. Wildhaber and his changing of the title. We were very hospitable at Penn, and whenever a European scholar that I knew, and I know a great many of them because I've been to Europe at least 55 times since that first visit in 1950, and I made it a point to visit the universities in Holland, in Britain, in Ireland, Wales, and England, and Scotland, and in Holland, in France, in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. all the universities where they taught cultures, where they were looking at their own culture, looking at Volkskunde or folk cultural studies. And I met the scholars. I could go over a list of them, like Günter Wiegelmann at the University of Münster, who was the best scholar in Europe on the food history of the peasants of Europe, and he wrote books on that. At Lund in Sweden, I got to know a very dear friend, Nils Arvid Bringeus, who is the leading print scholar in Europe at the present time. I'm cutting out Wolfgang Brückner. I put him secondarily at the University of Würzburg. But Nils Arvid Bringeus was so important in looking at folk prints. He wrote a book called Bildlore. Bild means picture in German, so he created this great term, Bildlore, and the book is an essential it's an essential approach using the computer age approach of the message of the artist, the message of the document, and the reception by the people. And this book should be translated into English. It has been translated into German. And I like the work of Dr. Bringeus so much that I dedicated one of my favorite books, the Pennsylvania German Broadside, to in his honor, to Niels Arvid Bringeus. Anyway, we were very hospitable. We had Lutz Rerich, the great proverb scholar from the University of Freiburg in Breisgau in southern Germany, and I always had them talk to my classes, and we sometimes had an evening session with these scholars after a gala dinner at the faculty club, and the students came and we could ask them questions. And one time we had a person named Dick Dorson come, and I took him to the library, and the first thing that he did was to go to the card catalog, we still had that then, to look up how many books of his he had in the library. Anyway, Dad Benamos should know that story. Anyway, we had a good session with Dick Dorson. I knew him very well, and I lectured at the Folklore Institute for him, and I traveled around with him at conferences and so forth. One time, by the way, I think you wanted me to talk about earlier sessions of the Folklore Society. Dan mentioned the one at Denver, and I'm still shaking with fear when I think of that. And we met in Denver. It was many, many years ago. I forget the exact date. And we were at one of the best hotels in Denver, like this one. We were up on the 11th floor in the evening, and the hotel began to shake. There was a terrific earthquake. And I looked for the handwriting on the wall, but didn't see it. Fortunately, it shook again and then stopped. But that was a rather frightening experience, and I've always kind of avoided Denver since. But other times, I remember the one in Boston, the one in Toronto. We had a wonderful Toronto meeting when I could explore the Quaker and Pennsylvania Dutch settlements of Ontario from there. And two, I remember at LA, which were important, and so forth. I could even see the La Brea tar pits one time. I went to see that, one of the great sights of Los Angeles, and so forth. Yes.
Would you say something about Alfred Shoemaker, your relationship with Alfred Shoemaker?
Yes, okay. I don't know whether you know the name of Alfred L. Shoemaker. He was born in 1913 in the country in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, which is still quite a Pennsylvania Dutch county where many people still can talk Dutch and often do every day. And he grew up speaking Dutch, but he realized that he wanted to become a university professor or a college professor, and he realized that if he has a Dutch accent in speaking English, as all his relatives did and all the neighbors in the town did, that wouldn't go over too well. So he practiced speaking English, probably using pebbles in his mouth, like who was a Greek who did that to get rid of his Greek accent. And he spoke very perfect English after that. He had a theological education, as I did too, and in his speaking he somehow had somewhat of a ministerial tone occasionally, but not always, and he was a brilliant scholar. He was able to go to Europe long before I got there in 1950. He spent his junior year at Heidelberg College in Germany at the University of Heidelberg, so his German was very good. And he went to the University of Illinois and got a degree in Germanics, and he taught German at several colleges before he landed at Franklin and Marshall at the same time that I landed there. And we recognized that our interests were in the Pennsylvania Dutch culture and in its national importance, because the Pennsylvania Dutch moved south before the Revolution, all over the upland south, and then they moved north into Canada to Ontario and New York State after the Revolution, and especially they moved directly west. There are whole counties in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois that were settled by Pennsylvania Dutch, and where Dutch foods and Dutch religions and Dutch churches and sects were all replanted out there, and so forth. So it's a national culture that has national importance for its influence. And we agreed on that, and we founded these institutions. The first one was called the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Institute. We tried to model it on the institutes of folk cultural studies that we had both known at the universities in Europe. And I followed him in going to Europe so many times, and I had more contacts actually with the personnel of folk cultural studies at the universities than he had achieved. And I think it was from my work at the University of Pennsylvania that the term folklife and folklife studies really spread into the academic world. But it began through our use of it in Pennsylvania, among the Pennsylvania Dutch, in the Pennsylvania Dutch Folklore Center, and also in our very interesting journal, which began as a weekly, a tabloid weekly of 8 pages, called the Pennsylvania Dutchman. And there were 3 editors of that, and we all scrambled every week to get articles from other people and to concoct articles of our own and to edit the thing and proofread it week by week. And it lasted as a weekly through 6 months at least, and then became a monthly, I think, and then finally a quarterly, which we changed to Pennsylvania Folklife in 1958. But we had been preceded in that by Ulster Folklife in 1955. So the influence that Dr. Shoemaker brought of the folklife term was from not only from Sweden. He had studied in Sweden right after the war, and he became interested in the fact that the Swedes used this term folklife and folklivsforskning, folklife research, and he brought those terms to America, and we used them first in Pennsylvania. And then through my work, my many trips to Europe, and my personal knowledge of the personnel of the folk cultural university programs, I expanded this, of course, and began, as I said, the first folklife, graduate folklife program in the United States in 1965 or 6. I forget exactly when. I taught the first course in folklife studies in an American university about that time, and I had a brilliant student named Henry Glassy at the first class, and another brilliant student was Archie Green, who alas is no longer with us. I saw a very beautiful book that one of the universities has published about Archie Green and his career, and Archie was very important in helping to start the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And then another brilliant person, there were 3 geniuses in that course. The third one was Jay Anderson, who became very important in the museum world. Most of my students, I've had 53 doctoral students, and they all got jobs either in good universities or they were in the public sector, like state folklorists or folklife specialists, or they were in museums. And Jay Anderson chose the museum world, and he was interested in agricultural museums, and he directed several of them, one in Pennsylvania, and one in Iowa, and one in Utah before his retirement, and he wrote a book about, I think, agricultural museums. I forget the exact title. So, in honor of that, I'm very happy to see Henry here because he was in that first memorable Folklife class that I taught in around 1967, something like that.
Could you say a little bit more, Dr. Yoder, about the American Folklife Center, which you just mentioned, and the role that you played in founding that as well as Archbishop?
Well, for many years, people had the idea that there should be a national center for folk cultural studies, folklife studies, as I would call them. And there were several meetings that were held, and people like Dr. Dorson and I were invited. Dr. Wildhaber was invited from Switzerland to testify, and it came up to Congress, and I had to testify to Congress about the value of studying our own culture, the American culture, the folk culture that we inherit from our backgrounds, and it finally came. And Archie Green was a great publicist in that whole movement, and writing letters and so forth and getting action. And at one time, they thought that they would put the American Folklife Center in the Smithsonian Institution, that great empire of scholarship centered in Washington. But that somehow was not possible, and so the Library of Congress adopted it. And after many years, it was completely funded. They used to have to beg for money every year, go to Congress and beg for money. Alan Jabour can tell you about that. But finally, it was completely funded, and now it's doing a splendid job. And I'm happy both to see Alan Jabour, the former head, and Peggy Bulger, who was a student of mine. I found your graduate paper recently. I'd like to dig it up. And it was an A paper, I assure you. So I had something to do with the founding of the American Folklife Center. I was always in favor of it completely. And I was a member of the board of trustees of it, the board of directors for 2 years, when my dear friend Wayland Hand was the chairman of the board, and he was a very important influence on me too. He had pioneered in the study of folk medicine in America, which is a great interest in his books on folk medicine. And he had a conference on folk medicine at UCLA some years ago that he asked me to participate in, and John Hostetler to read a paper on Amish folk medicine and so forth. And it was the first conference in America held between folklorists looking at folk medicine and medical scholars. And there were people from Britain, famous medical scholars, and so forth. It was a brilliant idea of Wayland Hand's, and then later he had a brilliant idea to ask me to join him in sponsoring a national conference on folk custom, and that was held at the Library of Congress in Washington. And there are books that came out of these conferences. Wayland was very productive, and so forth. He has an interesting background. He was Mormon, but he always said he was a Jack Mormon and a non-practicing Mormon, in his later years at least. Forgive that statement, but he told me that. And he had the experience in Mormonism of going to Germany as a young man with another man as missionaries, and that's where he picked up German. And he always used German very importantly in his research. And I wanted to mention something about my students in German. I had, naturally, with my subject teaching courses in the Pennsylvania Dutch world, hundreds of thousands of documents and books exist in the German language dealing with that culture in archives in Pennsylvania. And very few people could read them. First of all, you have to know the German language to read them, and then you have to know German script, which I learned the hard way by reading and reading and reading. And I did have some very brilliant students who could read German and went into this, but others did not. And some people, because they didn't know German, would work on English folklore and Irish folklore, and so forth. But in my own career, I found that German research in Volkskunde, folk cultural research, was extremely important. And unfortunately, during the 12 years of the Nazi, the Third Reich, folklore was treated in a very unfortunate way. And there is a book that I must get from the university, the Indiana University Press, on the Nazification of folklore. It came out in the 1960s, but I don't have it. And I wrote something about it. I mentioned it in this book called Hex Signs, which just came out. This is one of the, I'm writing forwards to other people's work. I've written at least 20 forwards in the last 5 years, and this is a book called Hex Signs, Myth and Meaning in Pennsylvania Dutch Barn Stars, by a very brilliant young scholar who has just come into the world of scholarship, Patrick Dunware. He's at Kutztown University, and forward by Don Yoder. And I mentioned this book, I'll find it here. It's called The Nazification of an Academic Discipline, Folklore in the Third Reich, Bloomington, 1994. I must get that book, Henry. Anyway, this book goes into with very beautiful photographs, all through the book, goes into the meaning that they must have had for the painters of the hex signs and for the owners of the barns. And it used to be said that they were put on as witch signs, so that's why we call them hex signs, and we use the term hex signs neutrally without taking sides on the controversy. But they are not to protect the barn against witches. The word hex means witch, and hexerei means witchcraft. But they were put on simply because they were stars, they were beautiful designs, they represented the heavens, which we depend upon in farming and so forth. And also, one of my theories is that they were put on the barns by well-to-do farmers after the Civil War, mostly. We don't have evidence too much that they were put on before the Civil War to express their ethnic identity. And they have become symbols of Pennsylvania Dutch ethnicity. And for instance, if you go to the grocery stores, you'll find noodles, Pennsylvania Dutch noodles, with hex signs on the container. And speaking of the grocery stores, I also found that, well, the Amish are being portrayed as the great saviors of everything, and they're not even good cooks. And all these books about Amish foods, written mostly by Mennonites, and who are the big brothers of the Amish. And I was once shocked in my local supermarket in finding in the row of pickles, Amish Polish pickles. Now, what do they absolutely have to do with the Amish? They don't make Polish pickles. They make similar pickles, but not Polish pickles. Anyway, I did a book on Amish folk medicine that's very hard to get. It's published by Publications International in a little town west of Chicago somewhere. And I had a very difficult time, not a difficult time, but an interesting time in writing it. They said they went 6 chapters introducing the Amish and who they are, why they believe as they do, and what are their medical ideas. And I said, okay, you'll have them. When do you want them? They said, in 6 weeks. And I said, you'll have them in 6 weeks. And they said, you have the whole business in 6 weeks. They said, oh no, we want the first 2 chapters in 2 weeks, and then the next 2 in 2 weeks, and the final 2 in the final 2 weeks. And so I knuckled down and did it. And I also wrote the bibliography for the book, and a dear student of mine who did her doctorate with me on powwowing, by the way, Duncan, what's her first name?
Barbara Rhinestein.
Barbara Duncan. She teaches among the Cherokees in North Carolina. She's Barbara Duncan, but she was Barbara Reifsnyder, Pennsylvania Dutch name. And she took my course in folk religion where I talked about powwowing so much. And she had never heard of it, she said. And she went home to her mother. She lived on a farm in Union County near Lewisburg. And her mother said, oh yes, Union County has powwowers. They're still practicing. And so she wrote her dissertation on the practice of powwowing under my direction. And it's a very good one. So Barbara was asked to do the chapters on the herbal healing and the ideas, the ailments that Amish have or humans have, and how the Amish heal them. But dear Barbara had 1.5 pages of bibliography, and I had 8 pages in the book. Anyway, that's typical of John Yoder. But the interesting thing is that I am interested in doing another book on the Amish and using those 6 chapters and expanding it into 10 chapters with a chapter on the Amish Industrial Revolution. It's in Lancaster County, there are at least 1,000 Amish farms where the farmers are still farming, but they also have little machine shops and wood factories making furniture, gazebos, and so forth, which are run by hydraulic power rather than by the forbidden electricity. And so I call this the Amish Industrial Revolution. And there will be a chapter on that, there will be other chapters. And I actually got permission to use all of my 6 chapters in the book Amish Folk Medicine, just as they are in my new book. That's very unusual, but I have it in writing. So I'm going ahead with that. And I'm also doing a book, which is almost done, on the German Bible in America. And the first Bible was printed in a European language, or not in English, because the Parliament said the monopoly of printing Bibles has to be in the hands of the 2 universities, Cambridge and Oxford. And so no American dared to publish the Bible until 1782, at the end of the Revolution, in English. So, but Christopher Sauer in 1743 published the first German Bible. It's a very beautiful quarto book. And his son published a second version in 63 and another version in 76. And then there were Bibles. There was one in 1805 published in Reading by a man named Jungmann, a Moravian, who said that the status of the German language in America, in Pennsylvania, is so questionable now that he thinks this will be the last German Bible printed in America. And what a big mistake that was, because after 1805, the German Americans came, especially after 1815 and after 1830, 48ers who were politically engaged. They were different than the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they settled all over the Midwest, they settled all over the cities, and they published German Bibles and so forth. I'm also interested in the German language Bibles that the Jewish groups published, especially the Reformed Jews in this country. So this will be a general book, and it's very interesting because as I describe the Bible is perhaps the greatest storybook ever written by man. It certainly is. When you think of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark and Jesus and his disciples walking on the water, all these wonderful, wonderful stories. Anyway, that's another thing.
Could I ask Don one more question? Don, this is a small point. Why did you not write the article on folk religion in Richard Dorson's Folklore and Folklife book?
Oh yes, dear Richard, kind of jumped on the Folklife bandwagon. In 1972, he published a very good book which he called Folklore and Folklife, because of what we were doing at Penn. Indiana had to catch up to Penn there, according to Dorson. And he asked me to do some articles for it. I did one on folk costume, one on folk cookery, and one on folk medicine. And in all of them, I did a Don Yoder approach. I went into the European research on all these subjects where most research had been done. I went into the American research. I went into special problems involved in all of those subjects. And then I went into possibilities for research as a typical professor would suggest research to be done. And he liked those essays so well that he sent some of the other essays back to the people to broaden them in the way that I had done. But unfortunately, I wasn't asked to do the article on folk religion. I could have done a very good job, but I think John Messinger did the one on folk religion. And I never have quite approved of some of his emphases, to be personal.
Dr. Yoder, I had a question about your field recordings that you made in the early 1950s, your recordings of Yoder and of Sophia Baylor. Could you talk about doing the recordings?
Yes, okay. Well, I began recording because of this rich heritage in my own family, the Aunt Emmas and so forth, that had the photographic memories for the songs. I began recording songs in the 1940s, 60-some years ago, and two cousins of mine named Walter Boyer and Albert Buffington. Boyer was a Reformed preacher and a high school superintendent in Macantongo, the Dutch area that I specialized in. And Albert Buffington was a cousin of mine also, who taught German at Penn State and Tempe in Arizona, and also at the University of New Hampshire. And we joined forces in recording things. Some of it I did alone, but some of it we did together with a heavy wire recording recorder. And we published a book in 1951 called Songs Along the Macantongo. The title is very nice, it's alliterative. And it was the first complete book of Pennsylvania Dutch folk songs. And these recordings are now available, and I gave all of my special recordings to the American Folklife Center, and they have been computerized, put on CDs, and they're available. And all these wonderful old voices of these people born in the 1870s and 80s singing the songs that they learned as children at the camp meetings, and also the secular songs that they learned also in the towns. And one time when I was lugging my heavy wire recorder into a farmhouse, I was mistaken for a Jehovah's Witness preacher, which was the only time in my life, I hope, that I would identify with that, because they had canned sermons. My sermons are all canned also, but they had canned sermons that they would play from the recorders when they were invited in, if they were invited into the farmhouses. Anyway, I had fun recording. I still do it occasionally, and I'm interested in oral history. And right now, one of my closest friends, William Boyce Weaver, who is one of the leading food historians in America, has been going around and taking me along to interview people who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, all over the Dutch country on their food memories. And this is a specialized type of knowledge that he has used recently in his new book called As American as Shoofly Pie, the food lore and fake lore of Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine. He goes into all this Amish hoopla and so forth, and it's a very, very good book. But these interviews, he has over 200 interviews now, and they're like an hour and a half, 2 hours long. And they're full of wonderful ideas about what people ate in the past and how food was prepared, how it was preserved, and so forth. And he'll do other books on the basis of this, and he wants to expand his interviewship in west of the Susquehanna River. There's several very important counties there that have big Pennsylvania Dutch settlements. So that's important that my collection is at the Library of Congress. And Dr. Buffington also collected things, songs, and especially the religious songs that I had published in my book Pennsylvania Spirituals in 1961. He went on and gathered others, and we heard the sad news that all of his tapes were burned when Frederick Weiser, who was a Pennsylvania Dutch scholar, a Lutheran minister who collected things, he had been given by Buffington's widow all the tapes that Buffington made, over 100 tapes, 5-inch tapes. And we heard that Fred Weiser's friend who lived with him after Fred died tried to burn the house down. And I heard that those tapes were all destroyed. And this would be a priceless loss, an ineffable loss. But I heard recently that no, they were saved. They're now in the hands of the editor of the Pennsylvania German Society, who was able to save them. So this is very important. And all of these collections, we actually, the Pennsylvania Dutch language, it's now a language and not a dialect. In the 19th century, you never wrote letters in Pennsylvania Dutch. You do now. You never had church services in Pennsylvania Dutch. You do now, at least once a year, in the parishes where the people know Dutch. They have these wonderful Dutch services with the gospel songs translated, and so were some of them rather poorly translated, but some rather well translated. And you have Dutch meetings where you're fined if you talk English. And I've been to some of them. I got fined several times. And so there's an upswing in Pennsylvania Dutch language, and it's no longer a dialect. And my reasoning there is the High German language, of which Pennsylvania Dutch was a dialect. You always have to have a literary language to relate to a dialect, and it comes from a literary language. High German has dropped away, except for its very imperfect use among the older Mennonites and older Amish. They attempt to use it, but it's imperfect. So High German has disappeared. Pennsylvania Dutch exists facing English in the culture alone. And so it's a language of its own. And I write letters in Pennsylvania Dutch. I doubt whether any of you know Pennsylvania Dutch in this room, but perhaps there is someone. But if you do, write me a letter in Dutch and I'll answer it.
We have somebody in the audience would like to ask a question. Anyone?
Could you come and use the
Would you come
microphone?
use the microphone?
Yeah, right.
This is for history. And please state your name. Who are you?
I know this, I never would have come here. I'm Elaine F. I am proud to have been a student of John's. And I'm just curious to know, you were a founder of Kutztown's Folk Festival.
Yes.
And I was just there this year after a long absence, and you were everywhere. Kind of. But I'm curious to know what you think, what your original idea was, and what you think of Kutztown today, given that there is, so many festivals that have, I guess.
That's a dangerous question. Yeah, well, the first 10 years, we began with like 5 tents and 3,000 people in a few days in 1950, and by 1960 it became the largest festival of its kind in the country, with 100,000 people coming in the festival week. And we used the proceeds to gather material about the Pennsylvania Dutch, to archive it, and to publish it. That was our plan. And since then, unfortunately, Dr. Shoemaker overspent, and the Folklife Society, which we had founded in 1958, went bankrupt. But it shouldn't have gone bankrupt, because our treasurer was also the treasurer of Franklin and Marshall College, Donald Milan. But we couldn't control Alfred's buying for the festival, and we bought a farm of 80 acres outside of Lancaster, and we were going to build the best Pennsylvania Dutch open-air museum there. But unfortunately, the thing collapsed, and Dr. Shoemaker began having mental problems, and we don't know when he died. It's rather sad. he would have to be hospitalized, and then he would come out, be perfectly normal, and talk about plans and so forth, and he would have to go back to the hospital. And he eventually, we think, died in New York City, homeless, and without identification. And I made the statement one time in something I wrote that perhaps consciously or unconsciously, he was imitating that long procession of oddballs that he delighted to write about, the people who tramped the roads of Pennsylvania in the 19th century, the tramps and the fraktur artists who were almost tramps, some of them, and so forth. But we don't know when he died or actually where he died, probably New York City. It's very sad because he was a charismatic, brilliant person, fascinating to talk to, and he stirred up the Pennsylvania Dutch people. He traveled around all the time visiting people, and he created a card file, maybe 2 million cards of what he learned from his travels in Pennsylvania, and he also began to read the German newspapers of upstate Pennsylvania, which are full of social history of the Pennsylvania Dutch people, all dated materials. He would write an article on this from the Reading Adler of a certain date, and he would write down curious expressions and rhymes and so forth that he learned from the people that he interviewed. And all of that is put on, is at Ursinus College. There's a story there, we'll go into it, and it's not used very much. It should be transferred, this Shoemaker index should be transferred to Kutztown University. I'm working closely with Kutztown. This was the Teachers College founded in the little market town of Kutztown, halfway between Reading and Allentown, right in the midst of one of the most important Pennsylvania Dutch farming regions in captivity. And it was founded in 1867, and it became a university recently, and it has a Pennsylvania German, they call it, unfortunately, Cultural Heritage Center with an open-air museum, and I'm working with them in a lot of ways, and Dr. Weaver is working with them on to improve their gardens and their cookery and so forth. And there's a great, and this book on Hexine came out of that whole project. So Kutztown is really the center of Pennsylvania Dutch research at present. It used to be F&M when Dr. Shoemaker and I were there, and Ursinus has just a bit, but they've lost the person who taught the courses in Pennsylvania Dutch, and they're doing nothing with it, and so Kutztown is now the center of Pennsylvania Dutch research. I recommend it.
Yes, Alan.
Yeah.
Who are you, by the way?
Alan Jabbour.
Yes.
And when I became director of the American Folklife Center, people would ask, well, what is Folklife, of course? And some of our peers would say, well, now Folklife is just material culture. Folklore is oral culture. And so I went and read some of your writings, and occasionally it sounded as if you were doing that as well, because, of course, folklore and folklife as a department. But on the other hand, it sounded like you were meaning ethnology in a comprehensive way. And so I just would like to invite you to comment on that nice ambiguity.
Yes, thank you, Alan. Yes, it's not true that a folk life is simply adding material culture to verbal culture. That is not true at all. And I like to say that there was a conference on folk culture held at Arnhem in Holland in 1955, and the reports of that say that folk life studies should include folklore. Folklore should be subsumed under the more general aspect and discipline of folk life studies. And this includes the whole realm of traditional culture, including religion, which I've always stressed, and foods and costume, which I've worked on, and sacred space, holy corners of houses, and so forth. Dr. Bildhaber made a wonderful statement to me one time that he would like to teach a course for a whole year, a couple lectures a week, just on the house. And its division into sacred and secular space. Houses are divided in that way, and the use of the house and so forth. And I've been working on the idea, I like the word nidation, from the Latin word nida, meaning nest. And I feel that human beings in building houses are really building nests. I like that concept. So Henry, take that word along, nidation. Maybe you've already used it.